Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining Philosophy Talks with S.Friedman. My name is Eric Meyer. I'm the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, and I wanted to join and introduce Stephen this morning. Stephen, you've given some fascinating talks the last few weeks. One commemorated the International Day of Manned Space Flight. We had Victory Day in Groban, and the discussion and the presentations you've given have been fascinating and have taken us down a path and have made us think a lot about a number of issues. And we appreciate how you have discussed these from a philosophical perspective. And on behalf of the U.S. Consulate and the U.S. Mission, I'd like to thank you for your time volunteering to do these talks. Stephen was actually acclaimed by the New York Times as a genius philosopher. And I believe the last time that the New York Times claimed someone a genius philosopher was quite a while ago. Albert Camus may have been the last person to have received that acclaim. So we're really fortunate to have Stephen with us. And again, Stephen, really appreciate your time volunteering and doing these philosophy. So welcome. I present to you S.Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty. I want to thank Consul General Eric Meyer, Elmira, Tracy, Aaliyah, Dana, for the opportunity to give these talks, to give them on a weekly basis, to bring a philosophical perspective to a wide range of issues. It's a privilege, and it's, I hope, an opportunity to encounter perspectives that are not common in a lot of discourse and a lot of daily discourse, but also perspectives that aim for a level of precision, a level of rigor. So it's not a matter ultimately of belief or opinion or point of view, but a matter of things that can be established with a high level of confidence. So the philosophical perspective provides a foundation for our lives that we can feel a degree of confidence and safety within. And in turbulent times, uncertain times, interesting times, which typically characterize all epochs, of human life, of human society, philosophy is always there to help us, to guide us, and to guide us to a clarity and an understanding which can change our lives and make it possible for us to cope with the most difficult, the most challenging of circumstances. So again, I want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty for this opportunity and this privilege. Well, tonight we're going to, it's nighttime here. I'm doing this from Los Angeles. We're going to continue with what we had begun to discuss, what I had begun to talk about last time, the International Day of Light. Last time I focused primarily upon philosophical considerations relating to the physics of light, to something of its historical significance, the development of our understanding, important figures like Newton, Einstein, that played a fundamental role in revealing aspects of the essence of light. The second part of the talk last week that I didn't have time to attend to, as I thought I might not, was about enlightenment. And that will be more the focus of today's presentation. I want to begin actually with a valedictory, with a little tribute to an American, actually comic actor, writer, Charles Groban, who died last week. He was a favorite performer of mine, someone characterized by an unusual intelligence, sensibility, and a perspective on comedy that could be described as embracing the seriously comedic or the comedically serious, bringing together almost what's sometimes called a meta view and experience of comedy. He might be like performing in a sketch and start making comments about the performance itself. So he would take a perspective even outside what he was actually doing as a performer. That is germane to philosophy, in that philosophy is seeing the world from a broad and high perspective. Remember, philosophical results apply everywhere and to everything. It operates at the highest level of generality, philosophy does. So typically when we're talking about philosophical matters, we're talking about things like the nature of existence that pertains to any existing thing. Again, high levels of generality involve high levels of rigor. But one of the reasons to invoke Charles Groban is that his father was a Talmudic scholar. The Talmud is a series of commentaries on the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah, as it's referred to within the Jewish tradition. The Talmudic scholars would discuss issues with considerable like attempts at clarity of thought and representation. And in particular, they would challenge results and conclusions. So from his father, Charles Groban admits to having developed an attitude to challenge authority generally. This is central to the philosophical enterprise. If you begin a philosophical undertaking with particular biases or assumptions, your conclusions will be skewed in that direction. So philosophy demands a challenging of authority. It's central to the very beginning of the tradition, as exemplified in the work of Socrates, right? Probably the greatest of all philosophers, or the person who is synonymous with the origins of the Western philosophical tradition. Philosophy is a Greek word, love of wisdom, and Socrates was its, in a sense, highest and first pure embodiment. And Socrates' work was characterized by a questioning of knowledge, how we know, and if we know what we think we know. And that's related to one of the ultimate upshots of the philosophical enterprise that I represent in an aphorism. We suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. And so the philosophical effort to investigate our claims to knowledge is fundamental, not just to the field, but to its ability to, if you like, save us, or to address the challenges of human life by undermining fears and worries and anxieties based upon premature conclusions, claims that we cannot legitimately make, but we make ultimately to our detriment. another set of aphorisms, we suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. The issue of challenging authority was central to the work of Einstein. It was central to the work of Galileo at the very beginning of modern science. Famously, Galileo had done an experiment, possibly on the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That's certainly the legend of the experiment, that he had taken two objects of different weights and dropped them from the top of the Leaning Tower and demonstrated that, contrary to Aristotle's claims, to Aristotelian thinking, which had dominated certainly Western culture for, 1,500 years, contrary to what Aristotle had claimed about the nature of motion, these two objects of different weights would hit the ground and did in fact hit the ground at the same time. So it was that challenge of authority, that reinvestigation of what people had assumed to be true for centuries, that liberated modern science to begin investigating the world with new eyes. And that ultimately produced the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the technological revolution, and brought us to contemporary society. Charles Groban made one other remark that I just wanted to read, again, in tribute. He said, and this is something apparently he got from his father, from that Talmudic tradition of challenging authority and seeking clear understanding. One of the big flaws everywhere, probably since the beginning of time, is that people speak up and say things, and they're not really right. Well, philosophy seeks to say things that are incontrovertibly true and can be the foundation for our lives. Now, again, in tribute, I have some lines from the books of Joshua. That is a work that I wrote that is a philosophical narrative, a poetic narrative that chronicles basically my philosophical development and culminates in a section giving a poetic version of some of my fundamental philosophical results. There's a section where I address the Talmudic orientation and Galileo. It's something actually that I've recited before, but again, it's appropriate again now. And it goes like this, and it deals with the issue of Galileo establishing what's called the heliocentric view of the solar system, the idea that the sun is at the center, not the earth, as had been believed since antiquity. The ancient astronomer Ptolemy had proposed or had developed this earth-centered view where the earth was at the center and everything else was revolving around it, all of the cosmos around the fixed, still earth at the center of existence. It was the view embraced by the Catholic Church, by the Church. It was actually first proposed seriously by Copernicus, but not argued for as extensively as Galileo did. Galileo devoted his life, really, to establishing the primacy of the sun-centered solar system. It got him into conflict with the church. It got him basically imprisoned in his home under house arrest for the later years of his life. And he was also forced by the Catholic Church to recant his teachings. But as I've developed in other talks, the modern view, the Einsteinian view, is that not Galileo was correct, not Ptolemy was correct, but wherever you are is the still center of existence. That Einstein's work allows us, infused by really a certain philosophic understanding, allows us to describe the world as, well, to say that any given point other than ourselves is the center, is really to be imagining viewing the world from the outside. And that's not something we can do. The way I've sometimes put it is that Einstein was elaborating the physics of existentialism, the idea that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside. And we cannot do any experiments that will decide that we're in fact in motion and not at rest, at the center of things. So here's a poetic version of what I've sort of just detailed. Galileo claimed too much, as did the church, which likes to fuss, as did Galileo. And both would paint with too broad a brush. But the Talmud didn't rush and carefully considered why God delivered the 10 Commandments to a minor hill when a monumental majesty better fit the bill. And what did the scholars propose? That God chose modesty over majesty because God inclines to humility. And so it need not mar creation that the race rides a minor planet, truth to tell, a carousel, around an otherwise undistinguished star, earning by circumference a dizzying sense of what we are. So, again, a little bit of a tribute to Charles Grodin. There's another reason, though, to begin with a reference to a comedian. We're talking about enlightenment. And enlightenment really is a term that is most applicable to the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha is a term designating enlightened one. That's what Buddha means. So in the Buddhist tradition, laughter precedes enlightenment. And there's a deep reason for that laughter involves a response to a thwarting of expectation. When we hear a joke, the setup of the joke has us anticipating a certain direction that the joke will take. The punchline of the joke goes in a different direction. The anticipation of a particular outcome is characteristic of what I've called heuristic space. Remember, heuristic space is a convergent space. It's the space of objects in which we cluster things based upon approximate similarities. Any two chairs are approximately the same, similar for certain purposes in certain ways. That's why we call them both chairs. But any two objects, any 2 points are rigorously distinct. Otherwise, we wouldn't talk about two at all. It's that distinctiveness that characterizes philosophic space, rigorous space, what I call epistemic space. Another characteristic of epistemic space, it's divergent. It's characterized by difference, by distinction. One of the ways it's most manifest is look around. The world is different in different directions. That aspect of the world that you see in every direction that you look is the epistemic aspect of experience. How things are similar, again, approximately similar, is heuristic. Heuristic is convergent. Things come together based on similarities. Epistemic is divergent. Things are recognized by their differences. We exist epistemically. We promote our survival heuristically by noting similarities to what might threaten us, that allows us to avoid such things. Our technology manipulates various similarities ultimately. But so a joke is the anticipations of that the joke is setting up are convergent. They're moving in a certain direction. That's a heuristic process. The punchline deviates from that, is divergent from that set of expectations. That's an aspect of the epistemic. It turns out that the experience of the epistemic, of the distinctiveness of points, one after another, is how we can represent logically, rigorously, the nature of what Buddhism calls enlightenment. Enlightenment is the experience of the epistemic. Everything else is heuristic. So that's another reason to introduce this particular topic with a valedictory to a comedian. Another introductory point to make is within, Western traditions, within like the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we're embracing the concept of a God, of a deity. Those are monotheisms, right? And those traditions grow out of each other, right? The Christian tradition embraces the Old Testament. The Islamic tradition embraces the Old and the New Testaments as revelations, though the final definitive revelation is that of the Quran. Okay? But there isn't a rejection of the earlier traditions. In terms of the centrality of God, there's actually a Hindu parable that gives us some insight into how God, the concept of God, functions in terms of how we can access that concept, that experience of God most readily. According to this little story that's told, a disciple goes to her master and says, her religious master, her guru, and says, I pray in vain. The master says to the disciple, who do you love most in the world? The disciple replies, my brother's little baby. The master then says, go and pray on him alone, and you will see that he is Krishna. Only love can cure the blind. Within the Christian, Judaic, Islamic traditions, love can play a central role. I mean, we often hear God is love. Love can be a path to the deepest mystery, right? A path to God. The path to enlightenment, that, again, as represented, say, within the Buddhist tradition, is one of understanding. And so that path to an ultimate solution is one of philosophical rigor, because philosophical rigor provides the clearest and the deepest and the most incontrovertible understanding. There's another story that is told, again, this is a little bit in relation to how I began, in relation to the Talmud, the Jewish tradition. There's a story told of a rabbi and his son. A rabbi is a Jewish religious leader, spiritual guide. A rabbi and his son are in Eastern Russia, 100 years ago or so, a little bit more than that, 130 years ago, late 19th century, and they're observing a pogrom, where there's an attack on a Jewish village. And the son and the rabbi, his father, are watching from a little hill, from a distance. And they're watching the burning of this village. And the son says to the rabbi, to his father, the rabbi, I wish I were God. And the father replies, why? So you can change the world? And this the son replies, no, so I can understand the world. Well, the heuristic, the manipulations of technology, the understandings and investigations of science, and its application to technological developments and solutions to various problems that we recognize, is a heuristic enterprise. It facilitates change and can promote human survival. The epistemic, the rigorous investigation of our legitimate claims to knowledge and the fundamental propositions that we can embrace as incontrovertible. Past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. The world is different in different directions. Any 2 points are not one. That provides the understanding, again, that ultimately is the enlightenment that religious traditions discuss. Okay. The issue of enlightenment, of that type of understanding, is one that ultimately seeks to understand the world, understand our circumstances from where we are. There's often responses. I hear this a lot, again, within the Jewish tradition, where there'll be tragedy, there'll be suffering, and the response, the consolation, is that if we could see the world in its totality, if we could see the world from the perspective of God, then we would understand. We would understand God's plan. We would see how everything means and makes sense and is ultimately justified. That's not the philosophic perspective, because that particular point of view from which clarity or perspective is achieved is a point that is inaccessible. It is effectively a point outside the world. Right? So philosophic understanding is committed to achieving results within the world from where we stand. And again, the power of results in physics, like relativity theory and quantum mechanics, ultimately attests to the power of that perspective. It is itself a redemptive perspective, and it is ultimately the perspective of enlightenment that the Buddhist tradition embraces, where the ultimate conclusion, and we'll talk a little bit more about Buddhism in a few minutes, but one of the claims that is fundamental to the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist representation of what enlightenment is that this world, which in its turbulence, in its suffering, is sometimes referred to as samsara. This world of suffering is equivalent to the vision, the experience of nirvana, of enlightenment itself. So you'll hear formulations and read formulations within the tradition, samsara is nirvana. Well, it's the philosophic tradition is capable rigorously of representing something similar, that what's in front of our eyes is ultimately what we need to see more clearly than we do. That the heuristic is how we normally experience things. Our brains are effectively heuristic devices seeking similarities, overlooking minor, what we would consider minor differences, minor for some purpose. The philosophic, the epistemic, is embracing every aspect of everything. Okay? So again, distinctiveness becomes the basis for the distinction that is able to free us from general claims that, while they may be true approximately under certain circumstances, for certain things, are not rigorously true from where we are, where we stand, where we exist. My engagement with philosophy began when I was young. I was about 12, and I've actually told this story in a number of places, including in Phalaris's Bull, that play that I did in New York a few years ago. When I was young, reading a lot of science and math, and by young, I very young, like 7, 8, 9, 10, young. Okay? My parents were very generous in providing me all the books I could ever desire. So I would read a lot. And again, science and math were my main focus. But when I was 12, I happened to wander into a bookstore in Los Angeles, and I found a book by Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician, philosopher, also educator. He had been at Cambridge and at Harvard, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And he wrote a book, Science in the Modern World, that I took off the shelf and bought. It was a little paperback because I thought it was about science, and I was interested in reading books about science. Turns out it wasn't science. It was philosophy, and difficult philosophy. And that was my introduction to the subject. I think part of the comfort that I feel in doing philosophy and have, for my lifetime, since that point, is because I encountered something very difficult, and I forced myself to come to terms with it. So that when I went on to Harvard to study philosophy, at their department, which was considered one of the most difficult academic departments in the world, well, it wasn't quite as hard as reading Alfred North Whitehead at 12 had been. So, it wasn't a demanding experience for me. I benefited. And I always recommend to people, start with difficult things, and then everything else will seem easy and will become intuitive. Well, early in that book, Alfred North Whitehead writes something that remained with me from the time I first read it. And it's his claim that what matters most decisively, are those circumstances of such great generality that no one ever sees them. because they're always right in front of our eyes. Again, it's seeing those circumstances of such great generality that, because they're ever present, are always overlooked. That is the key, that's the door to, again, what Buddhism and other religions call enlightenment. That's the key to the epistemic. It's actually a theme that's emphasized by others as well. Goethe, you know how I like to quote Goethe. Well, Goethe made a similar quote. I mean, not quite as detailed, more to the effect that, commenting on the difficulty people have in seeing what is right in front of their eyes. And it's also famously the subject of a celebrated short story by the American writer Edgar Allan Poe, one of the greatest, one of the most gifted of American writers. He was a poet, he was a short story writer, and he is credited with having created the genre of the detective story. One of his stories, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, is considered the first such detective story, where the central character, Auguste Dupin, he's living in France, investigates crimes and solves them. It's the prototype for Sherlock Holmes and for, again, a whole industry, that was to follow in subsequent decades. The third such story, he wrote three in this genre. The third such story is called The Purloined Letter. And it's a very simple story. It's considered by many the best, of these forays into detective story writing. It's about a sort of a crime. A minister has stolen a compromising letter, and the government, the police, are trying to reclaim the letter. They go to the minister's home when he's not there, and they search it extensively. In fact, the first half of this story, and it's not a long story, is about the search they do, with a microscope, just investigating every surface, every object, in the environment of this minister's home, looking for this letter that they assume has been, coiled up in some way and placed, in some crevice or in some hole or opening somewhere, that is obscure and demands endless sort of investigation to find. And they find nothing. And in desperation, the police inspector visits Dupin, the famous amateur, the detective, sleuth of Poe's imagination. He tells him to go back and look again. He does, still no letter. The letter was never found on the person of the minister. He was randomly, accosted, on the street and searched, several times in the attempt to find the letter on him. No letter. It turns out that the minister, anticipating how extensively, the police would look into every crevice, has hidden the letter in plain view. He's sort of modified its appearance a little bit so it doesn't quite stand out, but it's on a rack, right in sight, of anyone that would enter the premises. Dupin does retrieve the letter and gets a reward for it. But the point is, the concept of hiding in plain sight is more or less originates with that story, and obviously coheres with the notion of our difficulty in seeing what is in front of our eyes. That difficulty is sort of clarified a little when you look at the difficulty that people have in drawing. Drawing is really not a matter of one's dexterity, one's ability to work with one's hands. Drawing is really a matter of seeing what's in front of our eyes, seeing it clearly and representing it not in terms of how we think it looks, but in terms of how it actually does appear. When you look at children's drawings, where they're drawing stick figures, right? They're drawing a face as a circle or an oval. They're drawing a body as lines and arms and legs. Again, just as lines, as sticks. What children are doing is drawing their concept of a face, their concept of a body. They're not drawing what they're seeing. They're, by a very young age, they are seeing the world conceptually. They're seeing the world heuristically. They're seeing the world in terms of their concepts, not in terms of their actual sensory experience of that world, which becomes very hard for us to do as we acculturate, especially as we acquire language. Because language is predicated upon our discerning similarities that allow us to cluster things together. Concepts involve clustering, involve grouping things based upon various similarities, what Wittgenstein has called family resemblances. It's a matter of approximate similarity versus distinctive differences. A painter, a draftsman, a great draftsman, like a Rembrandt, is seeing the particularities of almost what's reaching his retina. And that's the key to the distinctiveness of his representations. How one can look at a figure in a Rembrandt drawing and feel a presence, a personality. He's not drawing an abstraction. He's not drawing his concept of a man or a woman. He's drawing what he sees. And seeing is difficult. So, and again, the process of truly seeing is the philosophic path to the clarity and the certainty that represents the epistemic, the philosophic experience of the world, that insofar as it frees us from presuppositions, from approximations, and grounds us in rigor, it comforts and it grounds us. So the issue with enlightenment ultimately is to see what is in front of our eyes, and to see it as if we were seeing it for the first time. Because when we look around, we're able to name things, right? We're able to describe different elements in our environment. We're able to apply words, chair and table and wall and ceiling and lamp and glass. Right? Well, those concepts are based upon, again, approximate clusterings. The chair that we characterize or just label as a chair has similarities to other chairs. It has similarities to the chair that was in our room or at our table yesterday, the day before. The experience of what is genuinely in front of our eyes is something that the philosopher Stanley Cavell, a philosopher at Harvard when I was there, has called the experience of earliness, of seeing the world for the first time before we begin grouping, clustering things together based upon approximate similarities, right? It relates to the point made by the pre-Socratic, living before Socrates, Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that we can't step into the same river twice because its waters are always changing. Well, we can step into the same river twice in the sense that what we call river is characterized by a clustering of similar, not exactly the same things. So the river, is when we apply that term river to those flowing waters, we're overlooking, the distinctiveness of each moment, that the river presents. The heuristic is overlooking those distinctions and embracing, again, approximate similarities. The epistemic is grounded in those distinctions. And one of the fundamental aspects of that epistemic, as I've mentioned, is that the world is different in different directions. An even deeper characterization of it is, to the degree that what you see around you is familiar to you, that you can, again, apply linguistic terms to it, that you can name things, but really to the degree that anything around you is familiar, feels comfortable because it is familiar, you are seeing the heuristic. To experience the epistemic is to experience the world viewed for the first time, without anticipations based upon past experience and approximate groupings. To experience the epistemic is to experience the strangeness or the wonder of the world seen for the first time, seen in its distinctiveness, moment by moment, point by point. One of the ways to see that, close your eyes, or close them slowly. As you close your eyes, the objective space around you will become harder and harder to be described and to be characterized. Right? You'll have more and more trouble identifying the specific objects. Basically, one sort of path to this epistemic experience, again, which is a term just for philosophic rigor. And again, one way to describe that goes back to, from King Lear, that line, "I'll teach you differences," right? Experiencing those differences, moment to moment, point to point, is a fundamental characteristic of epistemic space, that is philosophic space, that is rigorous space, that again embodies the Enlightenment that religions have sought. So it's a process, right? It's a process of, again, coming to terms with the novelty, coming to terms with what it genuinely means to exist, Our minds, again, are heuristic devices. They are overlooking, distinctions and embracing similarities. That leads us in the direction of what facilitates survival, the manipulation of experience, technologies. It is opposite to the direction of what religions have described as salvation. So, okay, the epistemic is what enlightenment is seeking and embracing. Okay, I've mentioned that Buddhism is the tradition most identified with that concept. That identification is grounded in the origins of the tradition. And it's a tradition that I've been fascinated with for almost as long as I've been doing philosophy. When I was young, when I was actually in high school, I had on my door, the door to my bedroom, a quotation from Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. He said, "Even so, brethren, have I found an ancient road, an ancient path, trodden by Buddhas of a bygone age, the which having followed, I understand life, and its coming to be, and its passing away. And thus understanding, I have declared the same." What's fundamental to the Buddhist tradition is that it originates in the attempts by the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived about 550 BC, to come to terms with the human condition at its worst, disease, old age, and death, here and now, or there and then, but from where he stood, to find a solution to those problems that could be experienced, not from, again, some remote perspective that we might imagine a God to occupy, but from where we are. Again, enlightenment is going to be a matter of seeing the world in a certain way that we are not accustomed to seeing it, not trained to see it, not given to see it, but that turns out to be grounded in some deeper understanding of what is in front of our eyes. One of the things that's remarkable about Buddhism is how forthright Siddhartha Gautama was in addressing those issues. When I was reading accounts of the Buddhist tradition, I took the words of those accounts seriously. And one of those representations is a famous farewell that Siddhartha Gautama delivers to his charioteer. Siddhartha he was born in a privileged household. His father was the leader of a clan. Supposedly, according to legend, at Siddhartha's birth, there were prophecies that he would either become a great spiritual leader or a great warrior. His father, being a warrior himself, wanted his son to be following his footsteps and become a great warrior, a conqueror. He was aware, though, early on, that his son had a sensitive side. So to avoid his son becoming unduly spiritual and committed to spiritual directions and spiritual pursuits, he turned the palace into basically a pleasure garden in which all the horrors from which all the horrors of life, all the unpleasantness of human life was excluded. So Siddhartha lived in a comparative paradise, supposedly, for the first 29 years, until he married, he had a child, but he began to grow restless, and he wanted to experience the outside world, the world beyond these perfectly manicured, palace grounds. Father arranged for him to take excursions outside the palace walls, but so engineered them that Siddhartha would not encounter anything unpleasant along the way, would not encounter like any sick individuals or diseased or not see a corpse, not encounter the realities of disease, old age, and death by accident. Well, the gods were overseeing these pleasure excursions, again, according to the legend, and they manifested for the Buddha images of disease, old age, and death. And once the Buddha encountered that, he was shaken to his core, and he resolved to end disease, old age, and death, or die in the attempt. He felt that in a world where that was the destiny awaiting people, there wasn't time, there wasn't justification for play, for diversion, for a casual meal, for social relations. First, one must solve the fundamental problems of the human condition, then one can go and play. So the Buddha Siddhartha resolves, he's not yet the Buddha, to commit himself to the pursuit of a solution, to achieving enlightenment, okay? Which again will be a solution here and now, from within the world, right? And again, not after one's death, but here and now. And it had to be a complete solution, something that would end disease, old age, and death. And that's made clear in the Buddha's parting words to his charioteer as he leaves the palace for the last time and goes off to seek a solution, to seek enlightenment, by investigating the different approaches that human beings within his culture have formulated, and testing them, seeing what works, what doesn't, and if necessary, find his own answer that he hopes will be strong enough. To his charioteer, he says, "Tell the people of Kapilavastu this my unshakable resolve. Either I will end disease, old age, and death, and you will quickly see me again, or I will go to perdition, because my powers failed me, and I could not achieve my purpose." Well, that Buddhism flourished, that it exists at all, is a testament to Siddhartha's conviction that he had found a solution. Now, the form of that solution turns out to be one of the elimination of concepts. There are two ways to deal with the problem of disease, old age, and death that are readily characterizable. One, we go into a laboratory and we cure everything. Clearly, that is not what Siddhartha Gautama did or could even attempt to do, right? Not 550 BC. We are not yet able to come close to that type of solution. The other way to end disease, old age, and death, in principle, is to end the concepts. in some manner. Ending concepts is just as challenging, just as difficult as actually ending a disease in a laboratory. I've commented in the past on how Einstein ended the concept of the luminiferous ether, something that we don't hear about anymore because of Einstein's work on the theory of relativity. But it took the theory of relativity, that monumental achievement in physics, to basically end that one concept. So ending concepts broadly, concepts of disease, old age, and death, is clearly a formidable undertaking. The main way, in principle, that it can be done is at the limit of divergence, concepts are unsupportable. In an epistemic space, there are no concepts because concepts cluster. So an embrace, an understanding, a representation of the epistemic that's aconceptual does in fact achieve that end result. That's how philosophy achieves that Buddhist goal, that enlightenment, rigorously, through articulating the properties of a difference space where things do not cluster. The other way to do it, commonly, is imagine some limiting convergence where all things become one thing in the concept of God, for example. Then all distinctions vanish and concepts again no longer pertain or apply. So mystical union with God involves that type of solution, the type of solution that you see represented in the writings of the medieval Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. I am a something among some things, and so I go. A failure and inability to characterize within the oneness of God, right? That's the other extreme. So it turns out the limit of divergence and the limit of convergence both deconceptualize. I know that's a little bit sophisticated, it's almost mathematical. It really is mathematical, but it's a way to say it, and I say it just so you hear it. Siddhartha actually had something, well, the way Siddhartha achieved his results was through an analysis of change and concepts, that something is real if it lasts, and the thinking was in relation to the nature of dream experience. In a dream, when we wake up from a dream, the dream experience vanishes. It's not real compared to the persistence of the world around us that we encounter upon waking every day. It's fundamentally, approximately the same world, characterized by persistence. So Siddhartha basically begins with the stipulation, the real, the fundamentally real lasts. And we see that in the work of the philosopher like Spinoza, where God is fundamentally real because God is eternal, lasts. We think of the laws of physics as the reality because they're representing what is true under all sets of circumstances. That as laws of nature, they're fundamentally unchanging. That's the attitude, right? That's why we embrace physics. But under the Bodhi tree, when the Enlightenment tree, when Siddhartha achieves enlightenment, what he has is a vision of universal flux, of universal change. He realizes, or his experience is that nothing lasts at all. Not God, not physics, not anything. And so his thinking really can be summarized in a syllogism, in a logical form. The real lasts, nothing lasts. Therefore, nothing is real, including disease, old age, and death. That is the fundamental Buddhist logic. And it's that logic ultimately that leads to that deconceptualization of experience that allows the Buddha ultimately to proclaim samsara, this world of suffering, is nirvana when it is seen correctly, when it is seen in terms of that analysis. Now, of course, part of the problem with that analysis, why Buddhism is a religion, not philosophical rigor, is that we can't know that nothing lasts, right? That's a belief. And belief falls short of the rigorous demands of a philosophical representation. But philosophy can achieve those same results through the characteristics of an epistemic, a rigorous space, right? Where two things are sufficiently different that concepts cannot embrace them. And so concepts fall away. But I actually have a poetic summary, also from the books of Joshua, of what I've just described in terms of the Buddha's or Siddhartha's process, the logic he put forth. And I think I'll recite that. Or I will read it or recite it. Let me make sure here. Let's see one thing. Okay. Okay, let me try to recite this. So it's a summary again of what I just described. Siddhartha sought to end disease, old age, and death, here and now. But how? Not in a laboratory, through technology, certainly not 550 BC, but if not, then what? The reality extends to the limits of conceptuality and no further. But can we subject a concept to first-degree murder? That was the Buddha's attempt under the Bodhi tree, where he let fly the concepts of mortality in the land of the sacred cow. But how? For Aristotle, the syllogism was the model. The Buddha came before, but logic is a door. 1, the real lasts. Unlike the ephemeral shadow a dream casts. 2, nothing lasts. What Siddhartha sees in the breeze of life's immemorial pasts. 3, nothing is real. This is the seal, the Buddhist reveal, that peels away the skin of disease, old age, and death, the mask and breath of mortality, to steal freedom from the wheel. Okay, so that's a sort of a poetic version of a summary of what I was just describing in terms of the Buddha's enterprise. But again, the main goal was a solution right here, right now, which was a matter of seeing the world in a certain way. Now, as I said, the Buddhist way of seeing the world is based upon ultimately some beliefs. Philosophy does not embrace belief. In fact, there's an aphorism I wrote, belief builds boats. Philosophy drains seas. And the sea that philosophy drains is that heuristic sea, that heuristic space of approximate similarities, and it replaces it with the rigor of an epistemic space in which everything is fundamentally distinct and different from everything else. And so everything ultimately is a point of dignity, a point of existence, and a point of, well, enlightenment when it is seen and understood in its fundamental distinctiveness. So we see how philosophy is able to achieve the kind of vision, the kind of understanding that doesn't change the world, but allows us to experience it in its full and fundamental reality. And it's a redemptive reality that's always right in front of our eyes. And as I say, the best way to experience it, close your eyes. That's how you can enter this epistemic space. Now, what I wanted to close with is a little aphoristic book, and then I'm going to get to the questions from last time. I know we have a number, so this will just take a minute. The book is entitled The White Knight, Bright to Light. And again, it's an aphoristic book. It's poetry and philosophy. It's concentrated. So the important thing is to sort of feel basically the sound and almost the emotion, of the words. The ideas are the kind of ideas I've been discussing. Don't worry so much about like understanding it word by word, but I want you to just hear it and you'll get a sense of the kind of vision that philosophy is capable of bringing to us. Okay? An epistemic drains heuristic reins from normal planes. Epistemics give no ground, and so we live. Heuristics lace quintessentials. Epistemics embrace existentials. Circumspection lays direction. Predication stays orientation. Generality maintains non-predictive domains. Heuristics trust a deity's lust in constellations melting rust, as representation must. Existence, in consequence, from instance to dust, is just. And so we live to see what cannot be, what came to flame so bright to blind the sea, and through the white night to liberate reality. So again, it's a concentrated poetic form of many of the things that I say, over the weeks about epistemic space, heuristic space, what's right in front of our eyes, and what in seeing we can achieve the kind of solution to our circumstances that religions term enlightenment. Okay, now I would like to turn to the questions from last time, of which there were a number. And I have them here. I think I should be better. I thought I did. Wait a second. Oh my goodness. Okay, I had them and they seem, here, I'll find them one other place. Hold on one second. Okay, first question. What about other Shakespeare tragedies, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet? I talk a lot about Shakespeare. I tend to emphasize King Lear. That, for me, is the most important of Shakespeare's plays from a philosophical standpoint, and I use King Lear philosophically in a number of different ways, a number of different places. I also am drawn to King Lear because it was where I began my relationship with Shakespeare's writings. That line from King Lear, her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman, which was a kind of epitaph for Cordelia, King Lear's daughter, that I read in a perfume ad on a trip to England when I was young, struck me as so beautiful. The sound of it struck me that from that point, I started purchasing, volumes of plays by Shakespeare, reading through all of his plays. I recommend reading all of Shakespeare. He's that important. He's that great in terms of the English literary tradition. But so for me, it begins with King Lear. I've mentioned that John Keats, the poet, would always read King Lear before embarking on a major poetical work. But other plays also have weight for me. I'm actually helping some people right now with Macbeth. We're kind of reading through it line by line, and I'm sort of explaining, like what Shakespeare is saying or trying to say. Often from a given play, there might be like one or a few lines that stand out that seem to, for me, summarize the play. In the case of Macbeth, there are some of the most famous lines from Shakespeare. It's towards the end of the play. It goes, it's Macbeth speaking. He's speaking about his wife, Lady Macbeth, considered maybe the most fully realized female character in Shakespeare. She's just died, and Macbeth eulogizes her. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts his bare hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's a view of the world from the outside. That is not the philosophic perspective. There is a lot of philosophy in Shakespeare, in Hamlet. Men must endure their going hence, even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all, kind of a stoic response. But Shakespeare is not a philosopher per se. Right? He's a dramatist, the greatest certainly of English dramatists. But the philosophy plays a role, but it is not the fulcrum, of Shakespeare's work. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, the line that always comes to mind when I think of the play is, "A greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intents." And I was actually going to use some lines from Othello in relation to the talk on light. Towards the end of the play, Othello is intent upon murdering Desdemona. He thinks she's been unfaithful to him, and he walks into her bedchamber. He says, "Put out the light," and then "Put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out thy light, thou cunningest pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat which can thy light relume." So I am drawn to Shakespeare. I'm drawn to the music of his language. And he's, again, I think, the single most valuable of all English writers. And it's been the source of like a literary education for some of our greatest writers. The greatest writer among our presidents was Abraham Lincoln, and his education was mostly grounded in reading of Shakespeare and the King James Bible, which was written around the same time. But in terms of Shakespeare, the dominant metaphor of life as a stage and people as players, again, is a view from the outside. So it is not the fundamental philosophical perspective. The most valuable philosophical lesson in Shakespeare is what's announced in King Lear by Kent, the king's advisor: "I'll teach you differences." And actually, I have in Joshua a little summary of my first encounter with King Lear and that line, in that perfume ad. And it goes, "Magazines show scenes of where a nation leans, and what they choose to quote can be an antidote to sagas learned by rote. Even in a perfume ad, catering to a current fad, Lear can go mad. And when he does, Cordelia comes to mirror what he was. And when she goes, the king still knows her voice was the song of the rose." So that's my tribute from the books of Joshua to King Lear. Okay, another question. Let's see, hold on, Okay, does light have a certain impact on humans in both mental and physical aspects? Yes, light has a major impact upon us. It's actually something being currently studied intensively in the biosciences and molecular biology. The controlling aspect of light over circadian rhythm, right? Our daily rhythm, our being attuned to cycles of wakefulness and sleep in coordination to the prevailing light that we're experiencing. The Nobel Prize in medicine was awarded, I think, in 2017 for work on the circadian rhythm, on the mechanism, which again is still in its early stages of being worked out, by which the body is able to regulate its cycles of wakefulness and sleep in relation to light. There's, our eyes are obviously the most important receiver of light. Pathways from the eye to a cluster of neurons in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's about 20,000 neurons, nerve cells, seem to be particularly important in regulating the process. During the night, there's a gene that generates a protein that accumulates, and those proteins, as they accumulate, seem to regulate sleeping, and light leads in the daytime to the degradation of the proteins, and that relates to the experience of wakefulness. But again, we're early in the process of understanding exactly, how light does affect us, the actual molecular biology of the process. And there's a now identified psychological condition called SAD, S-A-D. It's an acronym, seasonal affective disorder, that there's a tendency to experience depression when we're not receiving enough sunlight, like during the winter months. So yes, we are evolutionarily connected to cycles of light and dark that has a fundamental and controlling effect upon a lot of body systems. The pineal gland is something that responds to this suprachiasmatic set of neurons and generates melatonin, which is able to help regulate sleep. Okay, so just a little bit, but again, this is an area of active current research. Next, light is a way to survive. I agree. Yesterday, I used therapy using ultraviolet light to warm my chest. What do you think about this therapy? I think you have to be careful when you're using ultraviolet light. There are different wavelengths of ultraviolet light. There's ultraviolet B, ultraviolet A. Ultraviolet B is shorter wavelengths, higher energy. It's the range of ultraviolet radiation that can cause damage to DNA in skin cells and lead to skin cancers and sort of premature aging, breakdown of collagen in the skin. Even ultraviolet B, UVB radiation, which is a little bit longer in wavelength, less energetic, seems to be able to cause cellular damage, DNA damage that can lead over time to skin cancers. So I would be careful with ultraviolet light. I would be more tempted if I wanted to use a source of radiation to warm to use infrared heat, the other end of the spectrum, much less energetic, but still experienced as warming. Ultraviolet radiation, again, it's actually used in the treatment of various medical conditions, dermatological conditions, eczema. It's even used in the treatment of one category of skin cancer, but just one. The majority of skin cancers, like melanomas, which are the most serious of skin cancers, are linked primarily to ultraviolet light exposure. So I would be careful. Next, one thing in Harry Potter Part 3, there's a speech by Dumbledore about light in the beginning of this movie. What do you think? Do you agree with him? Okay. And apparently that wasn't in the book. Now, I am not a Harry Potter fan. I've seen the first movie, that's all. I have not seen Harry Potter 3, but I looked up that speech, okay? And the critical line is in, let me see here, I wrote it down somewhere. That critical line is that we can find happiness in the greatest darkness if we just remember to turn on the light. Okay, well, that actually relates to something in Shakespeare, in Hamlet. I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself king of infinite space. Well, I take that line from Harry Potter metaphorically. The kind of light that we want to turn on is that light of philosophic understanding. And yes, even we've been talking about enlightenment. One of the characteristics of enlightenment within the Buddhist tradition is the ability to endure even torture while firmly committed to that experience of enlightenment. The Buddhist tradition gives lots of anecdotes about people, Buddhas, historical Buddhas, being tortured to death in one way or another and smiling through the process because of their understanding fundamentally. I think I'll talk more about that in another talk. I couldn't deal with that at length. In terms of why that's not in the book but is in the film, that is common in the making of movies. That when we're dealing with theater, with plays, the script is sacrosanct, it's sacred, and will not be altered by a director of the play. The script is considered the fundamental element of a stage play. But a film is seen to be primarily a visual medium. And so the script is in the service of that overall visual product, that visual result. So scripts are commonly manipulated, altered. It's not unusual for there to be radical changes in scripts as the need is seen to serve the overall visual progression and dramatic progression of the film. So the script is sacred in a stage play. It is considered just an element to contribute to the overall achievement of the film and will be altered, as the film seems to demand it in the estimation of the director. And I think we have one more. If I'm not mistaken, when the Nazis won in Germany, they rejected Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. Yes. The main composer embraced by the Nazi regime was Wagner. The Nazis did, in general, reject a lot of the art that the Western tradition has celebrated. What I recommend is to look at some of the actual visual art, especially the sculpture produced during the Nazi regime. The great art movements of the early 20th century, like German Expressionism, were banned. Cubism banned, by the Nazi regime. It was seen as decadent art. But when you look at the official art that was sanctioned under Nazism, the official sculpture that was produced, you will be shocked. You will be shocked at what I would describe as the soullessness of that art. I mean, if you want to see into the real sort of core of the Nazi, let's say, corruption, it's best revealed, most clearly revealed in the art. So, yes, there was rejection of a great deal of what has otherwise been celebrated. And the rejection of that art is actually to the discredit of the Nazi regime. The art that was sanctioned, that was endorsed, that was approved, has not survived because of its soullessness, I think is an apt term. I know it's a strong term, but I think it applies. Okay, those are the questions, and I think that will do it, right? I think if we have more questions, they're going to have to be dealt with next time, right?
Super. Thank you very much, Stephen, for such an amazing talk. Thank you for having us. And thank you for answering the questions. Thank you, the audience, for providing your comments, asking questions. We really appreciate that. And today we have got a lot of questions. Let me quickly read them out, but we will answer them in the next talks next week. Hello, Daniel. Thank you for joining us. Daniel is an active participant. He joins us weekly. Thank you, Daniel. We appreciate that.
Yes.
Hello from Terrace Town. Hello. It's your first time joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
So philosophy sounds great. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is great. Yes.
Comedy is an essential part of our life, at least my life for sure. That's true. Thank you for the comment. And the next question is from Daniel. There also was a course session where Haley officially rejected from his vision, but he didn't reject in his mind. So what do you think? Okay. The next one. Love is conjure the light. I agree. And what about duty and friendship? Mm-hmm. The next one. Hello, Mr. Friedman. Thanks for your philosophical talks. I have a question. Have you ever read Arthur Schopenhauer's works?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. If yes, what's his favorite and why?
We'll talk about that. Yes, and I also have some interesting anecdotes about Schopenhauer that I'll share next time when I answer that question. Yes.
Super. That's a great question. The next question is, yes, it's big trouble between parents and children because children see the world in a different way without their experience. But in some cases, parents can see modern changings in the world. In most, they wouldn't like to accept it. What do you think about that? Mm-hmm. The next question, Mr. Friedman. Recently, I found what my vision of life is. I realized that helping this world and people here is likely what I was born for. Therefore, I have a question. What's your mission of life?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Super.
Yes,
One more.
Lots of questions. Yes.
Mr. Friedman, when did philosophy acquire its popularity? When did people realize that philosophy is able to help people in some cases? I suppose it was in ancient Athens. Am I wrong? Mm-hmm. A comment from Almas Abidov. Hello, Almas. He says, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a comment from Elmira. Never look away about Gerard Richter addresses arts during Nazis and Soviets.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you. Excellent. Super
Okay.
productive philosophical talks.
Yes. Excellent. Yes, I appreciate all the questions, all the comments. Next week, as I did this week, I'll address them at the end of the principal talk, which again, I don't yet have the topic for, but I will be formulating it and it'll become available early next week.
Super. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for joining us weekly, for giving such amazing talks, for providing your time and efforts. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Also, we would like to thank again the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and our amazing speaker, Stephen. And thank you, audience, for joining us weekly. We really appreciate your comments and your feedback. Please stay safe, stay tuned, and we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye now. See you next week. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Thank you.